Miss Marple's Cracked Teacup, a sip that spelled doom. For 2 Chapter 1, the teacup's first crack, the sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage. Her sitting room, with its chintz armchairs and polished mahogany table, hummed with the gentle clink of porcelain and the murmur of polite conversation. It was a Thursday, the day of her monthly tea, and the small gathering of villagers filled the air with a deceptive calm, like the hush before a storm. Miss Marple, her white hair neatly pinned and her blue eyes sharp as ever, presided over the tea tray with the quiet authority of a conductor. Her guests, carefully chosen for their varied temperaments, sat in a loose circle. Mrs. Clara Bantry, whose booming laugh often drowned out her husband's quieter remarks. Dr. Ernest Haydock, the village physician, whose fingers twitched as if longing for his stethoscope. Miss Lavinia Price, the postmistress, with her pinched lips and penchant for gossip. And Mr. Rupert Giles, a newcomer to the village, whose tailored suit and guarded smile had already set tongues wagging. The 5th guest, Mrs. Evelyn Dane, a widow of fragile health, sipped her tea with trembling hands, her eyes darting nervously. The tea was Darjeeling, steeped to perfection, and the scones were fresh from Miss Marple's oven, served with clotted cream and strawberry jam. On the table, her prized collection of porcelain teacups gleamed, each one a delicate relic of a bygone era, their floral patterns catching the light. Miss Marple's fingers brushed one cup, a favourite with rosebuds and a gold rim, as she passed it to Mrs. Dane. She noticed with a flicker of unease a faint irregularity in its surface. But the moment passed as Mrs. Bantry launched into a story about her prize roses. "And I swear, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice carrying, "the aphids this year are positively diabolical. Colonel Bantry says we ought to hire a squadron of ladybirds." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly as she knitted in her chair. "Nature has its own ways of balancing things, Clara. Ladybirds or not, your roses always bloom." Dr. Haydock chuckled, adjusting his glasses. "Balance, indeed, though I dare say human nature could use a bit more of it. Too many nerves in this village lately." His gaze lingered on Mrs. Dane, who coughed delicately into a lace handkerchief. "Oh, don't be morbid, Ernest," Miss Price snapped, her teaspoon clattering against her saucer. "We're here for tea, not a diagnosis." She turned to Mr. Giles, her eyes narrowing. "And you, Mr. Giles, how are you finding St. Mary Mead? Not too dull for a man of your sophistication?" Mr. Giles's smile was smooth, practised. "Quite the contrary, Miss Price. The village has a certain charm, and Miss Marple's hospitality is unmatched." He raised his teacup in a small toast, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction too long. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene, but her mind alert. She noted the slight tremor in Mrs. Dane's hand as she set down her cup, the way Dr. Haydock's fingers tightened. On his saucer, the faint flush on Miss Price's cheeks. Small things, perhaps, but to Miss Marple they were threads in a tapestry yet to be woven. As the conversation turned to the upcoming church fete, Miss Marple rose to refill the teapot. Her fingers brushed the rosebud teacup again, now resting on the tray, and this time she paused. There it was, a hairline crack, barely visible, snaking from the rim toward the base. Her heart gave a quiet lurch. The cup, had been flawless when she'd set it out that morning. She glanced at her guests, their faces bathed in the soft light, and a shadow of suspicion settled in her mind. "Jane, dear, your wool gathering," Mrs. Bantry teased, breaking her reverie. "More tea, or shall we move to the sherry?" Miss Marple smiled, setting the teapot down. "Tea, I think, Clara. There's time enough for sherry later." She poured, her movements deliberate, her eyes flicking to the cracked teacup. It sat innocently among the others, its secret known only to her. For now. The afternoon wore on, the guests departing one by one, with promises to meet at the fete. Mrs. Dane lingered, clutching her shawl, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Your teas are a comfort." Her eyes, wide and haunted, held Miss Marple's for a moment before she hurried into the dusk. Alone, Miss Marple stood by the table, the cracked teacup in her hands. She turned it slowly, the porcelain cool against her skin. A crack, she thought, was never just a crack. It was a warning, a whisper of something broken, something wrong. And as the last light faded from the room, she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. A Bitter Brew. The morning after Miss Marple's tea party dawned grey and heavy, the air thick with the promise of rain. St. Mary Mead stirred slowly, its cobblestone lanes quiet. St. Mary Mead's residents were accustomed to the rhythm of village life, morning deliveries, the clatter of milk bottles, the chatter of early risers at the post office. But by 9 o'clock, a different sound rippled through the village. The sharp wail of an ambulance siren, slicing through the quiet like a knife. Miss Marple was in her garden, pruning her roses, and she heard it. Her secateurs paused mid-snip, and her eyes narrowed. Sirens were rare in St. Mary Mead, and her instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, told her this was no ordinary mishap. By the time she reached her cottage, the telephone was ringing. It was Mrs. Bantry, her voice breathless with shock. "Jane, it's dreadful. Mrs. Dane, Evelyn, she's dead. Found this morning in her sitting room, cold as stone. They're saying poison." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the receiver. "Poison?" she repeated, her voice calm, but her mind racing. "Are they certain?" "That's what Dr. Haydock said. He was called in before the ambulance arrived. Oh, Jane, she was at your tea yesterday. What if—" Mrs. Bantry's words tumbled over each other, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, fixed on the cracked teacup now safely tucked in her china cabinet. "I'll come by the vicarage later, Clara," Miss Marple said, cutting through the panic. "We'll talk then." She hung up, her gaze drifting to the window. Poison, and only hours after her tea. The coincidence was no coincidence at all. By noon, the village was abuzz. Miss Price, behind the post office counter, dispensed, gossip as freely as stamps. "Poor Mrs. Dane," she said to a cluster of villagers, her eyes gleaming. "Always so frail, but who'd have thought? They say her lips were blue, and there was a cup of tea spilled on the rug. Cold tea, mind you, as if she'd been dead for hours." Miss Marple, stopping by to mail a letter, listened without comment. Blue lips, a spilled cup. She filed the details away, her face a mask of mild interest. "Such a shock," she murmured, and Miss Price nodded vigorously, oblivious to the calculations behind Miss Marple's serene expression. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to Mrs. Dane's cottage, a neat little house with ivy climbing its walls. The police were there, their cars parked haphazardly, and a small crowd lingered at the gate. Dr. Haydock emerged as she approached, his face drawn. "Miss Marple," he greeted, wiping his brow. "A bad business, this. Cyanide, from the look of it. Fast acting. She didn't suffer long." "Cyanide," Miss Marple echoed, her tone thoughtful. "Not a common household item, I should think." "No, indeed. The police are searching the place now. They'll want to speak to everyone who saw her yesterday." His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of unease. "You had tea with her, didn't you?" "I did," Miss Marple said simply. "A small gathering. She seemed tired, perhaps, but not unwell." She paused as if struck by a thought. "Dr. Haydock, you attended her, didn't you? For her nerves, I believe." He nodded, his jaw tight. "Prescribed her something mild to help her sleep. Nothing to do with this, of course. Poor woman. She'd had a hard life. Widowed young, no children, and that business with her brother years ago." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Her brother? Wastrel by all accounts. Gambled away their inheritance, then vanished. Left her with debts and a broken heart. She never spoke of it, but village memory is long." He glanced at his watch. "I must go. The coroner's waiting." As he left, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the cottage. The police had cordoned off the entrance, but she noted the open window, the curtains fluttering, a detail small but nagging. Cyanide was quick but not instant. Had Mrs. Dane opened the window in her final moments, or had someone else? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat with a cup of tea, her own blend carefully brewed, and opened her notebook. She listed the tea party guests: Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Miss Price, Mr. Giles, and Mrs. Dane. 5 cups, 1 cracked. 5 guests, 1 dead. She tapped her pencil against the page, her thoughts circling back to the teacup. Had the crack been an accident, or something more sinister? And why Mrs. Dane, whose nervous manner had seemed so unthreatening? The village would talk, of course. They would speculate about Mrs. Dane's past, her solitude, her fragility. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. She closed her notebook and stood, her gaze falling on the china cabinet. The cracked teacup sat on its shelf, its rosebud pattern gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. A clue, perhaps, or a distraction. Either way, it was hers to unravel. As the first raindrops pattered against the window, Miss Marple made a decision. She would attend the inquest, listen to the whispers, and watch the faces of those who had shared her tea. Someone, she was certain, had poured a bitter brew indeed, and she would find them before they struck again. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Vicarage. The vicarage of St. Mary Mead stood at the edge of the village, its stone walls weathered but sturdy, its garden a riot of late summer roses. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and old books, and the low hum of voices carried from the drawing-room. Miss Marple, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stepped through the arched doorway, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. She had come to discuss Mrs. Dane's death, but she knew the vicarage was as much a crucible for village secrets as it was a place of solace. The vicar, Reverend Clement, greeted her with a weary smile. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come. This business with poor Mrs. Dane has us all shaken." His wife, Griselda, younger and more impulsive, hovered near the tea-tray, her usual cheer subdued. "It's simply awful," Griselda said, pouring tea with a slight tremble. "Poison, of all things! It's like something out of a novel. And to think she was at your tea, Jane, only hours before." She handed Miss Marple a cup, her eyes wide with curiosity. Miss Marple accepted the tea, her expression mild. "A tragedy. Indeed, I thought it best to share what I know with you both, as you were at the tea as well." She settled into an armchair, her knitting bag at her side, and let the conversation unfold. Reverend Clement ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I confess I barely noticed Mrs. Dane that afternoon. She was so quiet, always shrinking into herself. But you, Miss Marple, you see things others miss. Did anything strike you as unusual?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she began to knit, her fingers moving with the precision of habit. "People are rarely as they seem, Reverend. Mrs. Dane was nervous, yes, but I wonder if it was more than her health troubling her." She paused, her eyes flicking to Griselda. "You spoke to her about the church fete, didn't you? She seemed reluctant to volunteer." Griselda frowned, stirring her tea. "Oh, yes, I thought she might help with the cake stall, but she said she wasn't up to it. Kept twisting her handkerchief, poor thing. I suppose she was feeling ill even. Then, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral. She sipped her tea, her mind replaying the tea party. Mrs. Dane's trembling hands, the way she'd glanced at Mr. Giles when he spoke, the faint clink of her teacup against its saucer, and the crack in the rosebud teacup, unnoticed by all but her. "Griselda, you mentioned my teacup collection at the tea. You said they were lovely, but old. I believe you asked where I got them." Griselda blinked, caught off guard. "Did I? Oh, yes, I suppose I did. They're so delicate, Jane, like something from a museum. I just wondered if they had a story." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Most things do, if you look closely enough. That particular set, the rosebud pattern, came from an old friend, Miss Hartnell, who passed some years ago. She was fond of beautiful things, but not always careful with them." Her voice was light, but her words carried weight. Miss Hartnell's name, she knew, might stir memories, and she watched the Clements closely. Reverend Clement's brow furrowed. "Miss Hartnell, I remember her. A formidable woman, always organising something. Didn't she have a falling out with someone in the village? A family matter, I think." "Her brother," Griselda supplied, leaning forward. "There was talk of a scandal, money, or a will, or some such thing. But that was ages ago, wasn't it? Surely it's nothing to do with Mrs. Dane." Miss Marple's needles paused just for a moment. "Surely," she agreed, but her mind was elsewhere. Miss Hartnell's brother, like Mrs. Dane's, had been a figure of disgrace, leaving debts and broken ties. A coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple distrusted coincidences. The teacup, with its crack and its history, seemed to whisper of connections, yet to be uncovered. The conversation turned to village matters, the fete, the choir, the new organ fund. But Miss Marple listened with only half an ear. She noted the way Griselda's hands fluttered when she spoke of Mrs. Dane, the way Reverend Clement's gaze drifted to the window, as if seeking escape. Small things, but telling. The vicarage, with its warm hearth and polished surfaces, hid its own shadows, and Miss Marple was adept at finding them. As she prepared to leave, Griselda pressed a scone into her hands, wrapped in a napkin. "For later, Jane, and do be careful. If there's a poisoner in St. Mary Mead, none of us are safe." Miss Marple thanked her, her smile serene. "I'm always careful, Griselda, and I find that most dangers reveal themselves if you know where to look." She stepped into the gathering dusk, the scone warm in her basket, her thoughts heavy with questions. The teacups crack, Mrs. Dane's death, the whispers of old scandals. They were pieces of a puzzle, scattered but not random. As she walked, home, the vicarage fading behind her, Miss Marple resolved to trace the teacup's story, for she suspected it held the key to a truth far darker than the village could imagine. Chapter 4. The Second Sip. The rain that had threatened St. Mary Mead for days finally broke on Saturday morning, a steady drizzle that turned the village lanes to mud and kept most residents indoors. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred, her umbrella bobbing as she made her way to the village hall for the inquest into Mrs. Dane's death. The hall was crowded, the air thick with damp wool and whispered speculation, but her attention was elsewhere, on the cracked teacup, now locked in her cottage, and the nagging sense that the puzzle was far from complete. The inquest was brief. The coroner's voice clipped as he outlined the facts. Mrs. Evelyn Dane, aged 52, found dead by her charwoman at 8:15 a.m. on Friday. Cause of death, cyanide poisoning, confirmed by autopsy. No note, no obvious source of the poison. The verdict was murder by person or persons unknown, and a murmur rippled through the crowd as the gavel fell. Miss Marple, seated near the back, noted the faces of her tea-party guests. Mrs. Bantry, pale but composed. Dr. Haydock, scribbling in a notebook. Miss Price, her lips pursed. Mr. Giles, his expression unreadable. Each, she thought, carried a piece of the truth, whether they knew it or not. She was preparing to leave when the news came, delivered by a breathless Miss Price, who pushed through the crowd to reach her. "Miss Marple, it's happened again. Dr. Haydock's just been called. Miss Price, Lavinia, she's dead. They found her at the post office not an hour ago. Poison, they think, the same as Mrs. Dane." The hall erupted in gasps and exclamations, but Miss Marple's reaction was a quiet intake of breath, her mind sharpening like a blade. 2 deaths, both from her tea-party, both by poison. The coincidence was no longer a possibility. It was a pattern. She murmured a polite excuse and slipped out, her umbrella snapping open as she hurried towards the post office. The scene was chaotic, with police constables cordoning off the post office's narrow entrance, and villagers clustering, under awnings, their voices a low hum of fear. Dr. Haydock emerged from the building, his face grim, and spotted Miss Marple at once. "Jane," he said, his voice low, "it's cyanide again." She was at her counter, a cup of tea beside her, collapsed before anyone could help. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the post office window, where a constable was sealing the door. "A cup of tea," she repeated softly. "Was it her own, do you think?" Haydock frowned. "Hard to say. The police are taking it for analysis. But Jane, this is madness. 2 women, both at your tea, both poisoned within days. The village is in a panic." "And rightly so," came a new voice, sharp and authoritative. Inspector Craddock, a youngish man with a brisk manner and a city accent, stepped forward, his notebook in hand. "Miss Marple, I presume? I'll need to speak with everyone who attended your tea party. This is no longer a single murder. It's a spree." Miss Marple inclined, her head, her expression serene, but her eyes keen. "Of course, Inspector, I'm at your disposal, but may I ask, have you considered the timing? Mrs. Dane died Thursday night, Miss Price this morning. The poison, I understand, acts quickly." Craddock's brow furrowed. "We're looking into it. The tea at your gathering is an obvious link, but cyanide isn't something you slip into a cup unnoticed. We'll need to trace their movements after your party." He glanced at Haydock. "Doctor, you were there. Any unusual behaviour?" Haydock hesitated, then shook his head. It was a typical village tea. People chatted, ate scones. Miss Price was her usual sharp self. Mrs. Dane quiet. Nothing stood out. Miss Marple said nothing, but her thoughts were racing. The cracked teacup, the one Mrs. Dane had used, loomed in her mind. Had Miss Price drunk from it too, or another? She recalled the postmistress's quick tongue, her habit of probing into others' affairs. Had she seen something at the tea? Something worth killing for? As the rain intensified, Craddock ushered them toward the police car for statements. But Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the post office. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle, "Miss Price was fond of gossip. She might have overheard something or said something that made her a target. You might ask her assistant if she mentioned anything unusual after Thursday." Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "A fair point. I'll look into it. But Miss Marple, leave the detecting to us. This is dangerous business." She smiled, faintly. "I wouldn't dream of interfering, Inspector." But as she turned away, her mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments. 2 deaths, 2 cups of tea, 1 cracked teacup. The village, with its tidy gardens and quiet lanes, hid a poisoner. And Miss Marple knew the key lay in the moments she'd observed at her tea. The glances, the silences, the secrets unspoken. Back at her cottage, she unlocked the china cabinet and lifted the rosebud teacup, its crack a faint scar against the porcelain. 2 sips, she murmured, and 2 deaths. The rain drummed on the roof, but Miss Marple's resolve was steady. She would watch, and listen, and wait, for the poisoner, she was certain, was not yet done. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Porcelain. The rain had softened to a mist by Sunday afternoon, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a hush that felt more oppressive than peaceful. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, the fire crackling low, her china cabinet open before her. The rosebud teacup, with its delicate crack, rested in her hands, its weight both familiar and unsettling. 2 deaths, Mrs. Dane and Miss Price, had followed her tea party, and the teacup, she was certain, held a clue to the poisoner's design. Today she would probe its secrets. She turned the cup slowly, her fingers tracing the gold rim, the faint fracture that marred its surface. It was part of a set gifted to her years ago by Miss Amelia Hartnell, a friend whose sharp wit and sharper temper had left an indelible mark on the village. Amelia had been a collector of beautiful things. Porcelain, lace, grudges, and this, set with its rosebud pattern, had been her pride. "From a little shop in London," she'd told Miss Marple, her eyes gleaming. "Each piece has a story, Jane. You'll see." At the time, Miss Marple had taken it as whimsy. But now, with cyanide claiming lives, she wondered if Amelia's words held a darker truth. Setting the cup down, Miss Marple opened a small wooden box where she kept mementos, letters, photographs, fragments of the past. She sifted through them until she found a faded note in Amelia's spidery hand, tucked inside a programme for a village fete from 1908. "Dear Jane," it read, "the rosebud set is yours when I'm gone. Mind the cups, they've seen more than you'd think." The words, cryptic even then, now seemed to pulse with meaning. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. What had the cups seen? Her thoughts drifted to Amelia's life, a tapestry of triumphs and scandals. Amelia had been wealthy, widowed young, and fiercely independent. But her brother, Edward Hartnell, had tarnished the family name. A gambler and a cheat, he'd squandered their inheritance, leaving Amelia to salvage what she could. There had been rumours of a final quarrel, a will altered at the last moment, and Edward's sudden departure from St. Mary Mead. Some said he'd died abroad, others whispered he'd returned under a false name. Miss Marple frowned. Mrs. Dane's brother, too, had been a wastrel, and Miss Price had known everyone's secrets. Was there a thread connecting these broken families? She rose and paced the room, her shawl slipping slightly as she moved. The teacup's crack nagged at her, a flaw too precise to be accidental. She recalled the tea party, the moment she'd handed the cup to Mrs. Dane, the faint clink as it met the saucer. Had someone tampered with it, knowing it would be used? Or was the crack a mark of something older, hidden in the porcelain itself? Sitting again, she examined the cup under a magnifying glass, her breath catching as she noticed a faint irregularity near the base, a tiny scratch, almost invisible, that seemed to intersect the crack. It was no natural flaw. It suggested intent, as if someone had scored the porcelain to weaken it. Her heart quickened. The cup, she realized, might not just be a clue. It could be a tool, a vessel for poison or deceit. Her mind spun back to Amelia's note. "They've seen more than you'd think." She closed her eyes, letting memory guide her. In 1908, Amelia had hosted a grand tea at her manor, the rosebud set gleaming on her table. Miss Marple, younger then, had attended, noting the guests. Amelia's solicitor, a nervous cousin, and a man introduced as a family friend, whose face she could no longer recall. There had been tension, sharp words exchanged over the will, and later whispers that Amelia had hidden something, papers perhaps, or proof of Edward's misdeeds. Could the teacup hold such a secret? She set the magnifying glass down and leaned back, her knitting untouched on the table. The fire cast shadows across the room, and for a moment she saw Amelia's face, proud, defiant, guarding her secrets, even in death. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the surviving tea party guests, Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Mr. Giles. Each had been at her tea, each had drunk from her cups, and one, she suspected, knew more about the rosebud set than they let on. A knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed from the damp. "Jane, I had to come. The village is in a state, people locking their doors, refusing to drink tea, and Craddock's questioning everyone. He was at the manor this morning, asking about Miss Price's enemies. Miss Marple ushered her in, pouring tea from a fresh pot, her own, untouched by suspicion. Enemies, Clara? Miss Price had a sharp tongue, but enough to kill for. Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair. You'd be surprised. She was always poking into things, letters, parcels. She told me once she knew something about Mr. Giles, something he wouldn't want out. I thought she was just being dramatic. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, but her voice remained gentle. Did she say what it was? No, but she smirked, like a cat with cream. Oh, Jane, what if she said something to the wrong person? Mrs. Bantry's hands twisted in her lap, her usual bluster gone. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving new threads. Miss Price's knowledge, Mrs. Dane's fear, the teacup's crack. They were linked, she was sure, by a past that refused to stay buried. As Mrs. Bantry chattered on, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the china cabinet, where the rosebud teacup sat, its secrets locked in porcelain. She would need to dig deeper, into Amelia's life, into the village's memory, into the shadows of her own tea party. For the poisoner, she knew, was still out there, and the cups had more to tell. Chapter 6. The Guest List. Unravelled Monday morning brought a fragile calm to St. Mary Mead, the rain giving way to a pale sun that did little to lift the village's unease. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, a cup of tea cooling beside her, her notebook open to a fresh page. The deaths of Mrs. Dane and Miss Price weighed heavily, and the cracked rosebud teacup, now a silent sentinel in her china cabinet, seemed to demand answers. To find them, she would start with the tea party guests, each a thread in the tangled web of motive and opportunity. She dipped her pen in ink and wrote the names: Mrs. Clara Bantry, Dr. Ernest Haydock, Miss Lavinia Price, Mr. Rupert Giles, Mrs. Evelyn Dane. 2 were dead, their names crossed out with a single deliberate line. The remaining 3, Clara, Ernest, Rupert, were alive, but Miss Marple knew survival did not equal innocence. She leaned back, her eyes half closed, and let her mind wander through the tea party, replaying each moment like a reel of film. Mrs. Bantry had been her usual self, loud and cheerful, her stories of roses and village fates filling the room. But Miss Marple had noticed her glance at Mrs. Dane, a flicker of pity, or was it unease, when the widow coughed into her handkerchief. Clara was wealthy, secure, with no apparent reason to kill. Yet her husband, Colonel Bantry, had business dealings that occasionally stirred gossip, and Clara was fiercely protective of her family's reputation. Could she have known something about Mrs. Dane or Miss Price, something worth silencing? Dr. Haydock was next, his medical bag a constant companion, his manner brisk but distracted. He'd spoken little at the tea, his eyes often on his watch, as if eager to leave. Miss Marple recalled his comment about too many nerves in the village, his gaze lingering on Mrs. Dane. As the village physician, he had access to chemicals, perhaps even cyanide, though such a poison was hardly standard in a doctor's kit. His unease after Mrs. Dane's death, his quick dismissal of anything unusual at the tea, were they signs of guilt or merely professional caution? Mr. Giles, the newcomer, was the enigma. His tailored suits and polished manners set him apart, and his guarded smile had drawn Miss Price's sharp scrutiny. Miss Marple remembered his toast to her hospitality, the way his eyes had met hers, assessing, calculating. He'd arrived in St. Mary Mead only months ago, claiming to be a retired solicitor seeking a quiet life. But Miss Price's hint to Mrs. Bantry that she knew something about him suggested a past less innocent. Had he come to the village to escape it, or to confront it? Miss Marple set her pen down and rose, her shawl slipping as she moved to the window. The village lay quiet, its thatched roofs gleaming in the sunlight, but she felt the undercurrent of fear. She needed more than memory. She needed voices, the unguarded moments that revealed what people hid. Slipping on her coat, she decided to visit the village shop, where tongues wagged as freely as coins changed hands. The shop was busy, its shelves stocked with tinned goods and fresh bread, the air thick with the scent of soap and gossip. Mrs. Weatherby, the shopkeeper, greeted Miss Marple with a nod, her eyes bright with the thrill of tragedy. "Terrible, isn't it, Miss Marple? 2 women gone, and poison of all things. They say the police are questioning everyone who was at your tea." "So I hear," Miss Marple said, selecting a packet of biscuits with deliberate care. "It's a small village, Mrs. Weatherby. People notice things. Have you heard anything about my guests? Mrs. Bantry, perhaps? Or Dr. Haydock?" Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Well, Mrs. Bantry's been buying more than usual. Fancy teas, expensive jams. Some say the Colonel's in debt again, but you didn't hear that from me. As for Dr. Haydock, he was in here last week asking for rat poison. Said it was for his garden shed, but with all this talk of cyanide—" She trailed off, her eyes wide. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind filed the detail away. "And Mr. Giles," she prompted, her tone light. "Oh, him." Mrs. Weatherby's lips pursed. "Keeps to himself, mostly. But I saw him talking to Miss Price outside the post office, day before she died. Looked like an argument, though I couldn't hear what. She was wagging her finger, and he was red in the face." Miss Marple nodded, paying for her biscuits. "People do get heated over small things," she murmured. But as she left the shop, her thoughts were racing. An argument between Miss Price and Mr. Giles, Dr. Haydock's purchase, Mrs. Bantry's spending. Each was a thread, fragile but telling. She walked slowly home, her basket swinging, her mind weaving the threads into a pattern. Back at her cottage, she returned to her notebook, adding notes beside each name. Clara, financial strain, protective of family. Ernest, access to poisons, distracted at tea. Rupert, secretive, argued with Miss Price. She tapped her pen against the page, her eyes drifting to the china cabinet. The cracked teacup gleamed faintly, its rosebud pattern a silent witness to the tea party's secrets. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her resolve firm. The guest list was unravelling, each name a potential key to the poisoner's identity. She would watch them all, Clara's bluster, Ernest's unease, Rupert's guarded charm. And she would listen, for the truth, she knew, lay in the spaces between their words. The teacup, with its crack and its history, was her guide, and she would follow where it led. Chapter 7. Shadows on the China. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, its silver light filtering through the curtains of Miss Marple's cottage. The village slept, its lanes empty, but Miss Marple was awake, her knitting idle in her lap as she sat by the fire. The cracked rosebud teacup, now a talisman of the mystery, rested in her china cabinet, its faint fracture a constant reminder of the poisoner at large. 2 deaths, Mrs. Dane and Miss Price, had shaken the village, and Miss Marple felt the weight of unseen eyes, watching, waiting. It was just past midnight when she heard it, a soft scrape, like a footstep on gravel, outside her back door, and her heart quickened, but her face remained calm. She set her knitting aside and moved silently to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. The garden was a patchwork of shadows, the rose bushes swaying in the night breeze, but nothing stirred. She waited, her breath steady, until a faint clink reached her ears, metal against wood near the shed. Miss Marple's lips tightened, slipped on her shawl, took a small torch from the drawer, and moved to the kitchen, where the back door stood slightly ajar. The lock, she noted, was untouched, but the bolt had been eased open from the outside. A subtle intrusion, but deliberate. She stepped into the garden, the torch unlit in her hand, her senses sharp. The air was cool, scented with damp earth and roses, but there was something else. A faint whiff of tobacco, unfamiliar and out of place. She crept toward the shed, her footsteps muffled on the grass. The door was open, a sliver of moonlight, revealing a figure inside, their back to her, rummaging through her gardening tools. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The intruder was careful, their movements precise, but they hadn't counted on her vigilance. She considered calling out, but instead she retreated to the cottage, locking the door behind her. Confrontation could wait. She needed to know what they sought. By morning, the village was abuzz with her discovery, though Miss Marple shared only the barest details with Mrs. Bantry, who arrived at her cottage with a basket of apples and a flood of questions. "Jane, you might have been killed!" Clara exclaimed, her face flushed. "A break-in here! What were they after? Your silver, your jewels!" Miss Marple smiled faintly, pouring tea from a fresh pot. "I haven't much of either, Clara, but they went straight to the shed, then to the sitting room. They touched nothing but the china cabinet." Clara's eyes widened. "The teacups? Oh, Jane, you don't think—" "I think someone is very interested in my porcelain," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but her mind racing. She had checked the cabinet at dawn, finding the rosebud teacup undisturbed, but the other cups slightly askew, as if handled in haste. Nothing was missing, yet the intrusion felt personal, a violation tied to the murders. She had reported the break-in to Inspector Craddock, who arrived with a constable and a sceptical frown. "Miss Marple, you're lucky they didn't harm you," he said, scribbling in his notebook. "But a china cabinet? Sounds like a prank, or a thief interrupted. Anything valuable in there?" "Only sentiment," Miss Marple replied, her eyes meeting his. "The teacups are old, gifts from a friend. One, as you know, was used at the tea party. It has a crack, which I find curious." Craddock's brow furrowed. "You're suggesting someone broke in for a cracked cup? That's a stretch even for St. Mary Mead." He paused, his tone softening. "Look, we're following leads on the poison. Dr. Haydock's shed had no cyanide, and Mr. Giles claims he barely knew Miss Price. We're checking Mrs. Bantry's finances too, but it's slow work." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Slow work often yields the best results, Inspector." But you might ask if anyone saw a stranger near my cottage last night, or someone smoking a cigarette. They left a trace in my garden." Craddock jotted it down, clearly humouring her. But Miss Marple didn't mind. She knew the value of small clues, and the tobacco scent was one she wouldn't forget. As the police left, she returned to the sitting room, her gaze fixed on the china cabinet. The intruder's focus on her teacups confirmed her suspicion. The rosebud set, with its crack and its history, was no mere relic. It was a threat to someone, a key to the poisoner's motive. She sat, her knitting resumed, and let her thoughts drift to the tea-party guests. Mrs. Bantry, with her protective streak, might act rashly to shield her family. Dr. Haydock, with his medical knowledge, could navigate a break-in with ease. Mr. Giles, the outsider, had the stealth and motive to cover a secret. And then there was Amelia Hartnell, whose teacups had outlived her, carrying her secrets into the present. Had the intruder sought the cracked cup, or another in the set? And why leave empty-handed? As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple made a decision. She would examine the entire rosebud set, piece by piece, for any hidden marks or clues. The break-in had shifted the game, casting shadows on the china that only she could see. The poisoner was close, their desperation palpable, and Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve, was closer still. She closed her knitting bag and stood, the teacup's crack a beacon in her mind. The shadows were lengthening, but she would find the truth before they fell. Chapter 8. The chemist's ledger Tuesday morning in St. Mary Mead was crisp, the air carrying the first bite of autumn. Miss Marple, her black hat firmly pinned and her basket over her arm, walked with purpose towards the village chemist's shop. The break-in at her cottage had sharpened her focus, and the cracked rosebud teacup, with its whispered secrets, pointed her toward the poison itself, cyanide, swift and merciless. To understand its source, she needed facts, and the chemist, Mr. Polk, was the man to provide them. The shop was a narrow, cluttered space, its shelves lined with bottles, jars, and packets of remedies. The air smelled of antiseptic and dried herbs, and a bell jingled as Miss Marple stepped inside. Mr. Polk, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his counter, his expression wary. The village's recent tragedies had made everyone cautious, and Miss Marple's presence, with her reputation for seeing too much, only heightened his unease. "Good morning, Mr. Polk," she said, her voice gentle as she set her basket down. "I've come for some bicarbonate of soda, but I also hoped you might help with a small matter. The police are stretched thin, and I'm curious about, well, poisons." Mr. Polk's hand stilled on a bottle he was labelling. "Poisons, Miss Marple? That's a grim topic with all that's happened. Mrs. Dane, Miss Price, dreadful business." He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes darting to the door. "What exactly do you want to know?" Miss Marple smiled, her demeanour as disarming as a grandmother offering tea. "Cyanide, I believe, was mentioned. It's not something one finds in a kitchen cupboard, is it? I wondered if you'd ever had cause to stock it, or if someone might have asked for it." Mr. Polk hesitated, then moved to a ledger on the counter, its pages yellowed and cramped with entries. "Cyanide's not a common request," he said, flipping through the book. "It's used in some industrial processes, metal cleaning, pest control, but I don't keep it here. Too dangerous. The police asked me the same thing, and I told them I've had no call for it in years." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the ledger. "A wise precaution. But you keep careful records, I see. Might there be anything else? Rat poison, perhaps, or chemicals that could be misused?" His fingers tightened on the ledger, and Miss Marple caught the faintest flicker of unease in his expression. "Rat poison, yes," he admitted. "I sell small amounts for gardens and sheds, but it's arsenic-based, not cyanide, and I log every sale as the law requires." He turned the ledger toward her, as if to prove his point, but his hand lingered, covering part of the page. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze soft but piercing. "May I?" she asked, and before he could protest, she tilted the ledger slightly, her eyes scanning the entries. Most were mundane: cough syrups, liniments, the occasional pesticide. But one line caught her attention. Dr. E. Haydock, potassium cyanide, 10 grams, 12th August. The date was weeks before her tea party, and the purpose noted was laboratory use. Her heart quickened, but her face remained serene. "Dr. Haydock, I see," she said, her tone light. "For his experiments, I suppose. He's always tinkering with something, isn't he?" Mr. Polk snatched the ledger back, his cheeks reddening. "Yes, well, he's a doctor, you know. Needed it for some chemical analysis, he said. All above board. I told the police about it, and they cleared it." His voice was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow. "Of course," she said, selecting a packet of bicarbonate from the shelf. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Polk. It's comforting to know our village is in such careful hands." She paid for her purchase, her smile unwavering, but as she left the shop, her mind was alight with new connections. Dr. Haydock, with his distracted manner at the tea party, had purchased cyanide. A small amount, perhaps, but enough to kill twice over. His role as the village physician gave him access to chemicals, and his shed, though searched, might hide more than the police had found. Yet Miss Marple cautioned herself against haste. The ledger entry was a fact, not proof, and Dr. Haydock's unease could stem from guilt, fear, or simple embarrassment at being questioned. She walked slowly home, her basket swinging, her thoughts circling the other guests. Mrs. Bantry, with her family's financial strain, had no clear link to cyanide, but her protective nature could drive desperate acts. Mr. Giles, with his secretive past and argument with Miss Price, might have resources beyond the village's knowledge, and the teacup, with its deliberate crack, suggested a plan more intricate than a simple poisoning. At her cottage, Miss Marple set the bicarbonate aside and opened her notebook, adding a new entry. Dr. Haydock, cyanide purchase, 12th August. Laboratory use. She tapped her pen against the page, her eyes drifting to the china cabinet. The rosebud teacup gleamed in the morning light, its crack a silent challenge. The chemist's ledger had given her a piece of the puzzle, but it was the teacup, she suspected, that held the key to the whole. As she closed her notebook, a shadow passed her window. A villager, perhaps, or something more sinister. Miss Marple's resolve hardened. The poisoner was bold, their trail marked by cyanide and porcelain, but she was patient. She would follow the ledger's clue, watch Dr. Haydock closely, and let the teacup guide her to the truth. Chapter 9. A Crack in the Alibi. Wednesday morning in St. Mary Mead was deceptively serene, the village green sparkling with dew under a weak autumn sun. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, walked toward the police station, a modest building beside the church. The chemist's ledger had pointed her to Dr. Haydock, but she needed more than a single entry to unravel the poisoner's web. Today she would observe the police's progress, for Inspector Craddock's investigation, though methodical, often overlooked the subtle cracks in human nature that she saw so clearly. The station was bustling, with constables sorting reports and a typewriter clacking in the background. Craddock, his tie slightly askew, greeted her with a mix of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd turn up. You're worse than a bloodhound." His tone was gruff, but his eyes held a grudging admiration. "I only wish to help, Inspector," she said, settling into a chair with her knitting. "2 women dead and my teacup involved. It's a personal matter. Have you made progress with the suspects?" Craddock sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're focusing on Dr. Haydock. That cyanide purchase in Polk's ledger raised flags, and his alibi for Thursday night, when Mrs. Dane died, is shaky. He claims he was at home, alone, reviewing patient files. No one to confirm it." He flipped open a notebook. "We brought him in this morning for questioning. He's in the back now." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her face serene, but her mind alert. "Alone at home," she murmured. "Convenient, perhaps, but not unusual for a busy doctor. And Miss Price's death. Where was he Saturday morning?" Craddock frowned. "At the clinic, he says, seeing patients. His nurse confirms he was there, from 8 to 10, but Miss Price collapsed around 9. The clinic's a short walk from the post office. Plenty of time to slip out and back, if he's clever." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts circling the tea party. Dr. Haydock had been, distracted, his fingers twitching, his eyes on his watch, but she recalled another detail. The way he'd handed Mrs. Dane her teacup, his movements precise, almost deliberate. Had he ensured she took the cracked cup, or was her memory playing tricks? "Inspector," she said, "at my tea, Dr. Haydock was seated near Mrs. Dane. Did you ask if he noticed anything odd about her cup?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "Her cup? You mean the cracked one?" "He said nothing about it, just that the tea was uneventful. But he's cagey, I'll give you that. Keeps steering the conversation to his patients, as if we won't notice." He glanced at the door to the interrogation room. "Care to sit in? You might catch something I miss." Miss Marple hesitated, then nodded. "If you think it useful, Inspector." She followed him to a small room where Dr. Haydock sat, his face pale but composed, his medical bag at his feet. A constable stood by the door, and Craddock took the lead, his voice sharp. "Dr. Haydock, let's go over it again. Thursday night you were home alone. No visitors, no calls. Yet Mrs. Dane, who you saw at Miss Marple's tea, was poisoned that night with cyanide, a chemical you purchased weeks earlier. Care to explain?" Haydock's jaw tightened. "I've told you, Inspector, the cyanide was for a laboratory test, a one-off experiment. I used it up, and the police searched my shed. Nothing there. As for Thursday, I was exhausted after a long day. I went to bed early. I can't help it if no one saw me." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes on Haydock's hands. They were steady, but his thumb rubbed against his index finger. a small tick she'd seen at the tea. "Dr. Haydock," she said gently, "you were kind enough to pass Mrs. Dane her teacup at my gathering. I noticed you handled it carefully, as if checking it. Did you see anything unusual? A mark, perhaps, or a flaw?" Haydock's eyes flicked to her, a flash of surprise, or was it fear, crossing his face. "A flaw? No, Miss Marple, it was just a cup. I was being polite, that's all." His voice was firm, but the tick in his hand quickened, and Miss Marple filed it away. Craddock pressed on, detailing Miss Price's death, but Miss Marple's focus shifted. Haydock's alibi for Thursday was weak, but something else troubled her, the timing of the tea party itself. Mrs. Dane had left her cottage at dusk, seemingly well, yet died hours later. Cyanide was swift, often acting within minutes. If the poison was in her tea, how had she survived the walk home? And Miss Price, poisoned at the post office, had she carried a tainted cup from the tea, or was the poison delivered later? As the questioning wound down, Craddock released Haydock with a warning to stay in the village. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away, and followed Craddock back to the main room. "Inspector," she said, "Dr. Haydock's alibi may be thin, but I wonder if we're missing something. The cracked teacup, was it tested for traces of cyanide?" Craddock nodded. "We're waiting on the lab, but it's tricky. The cup was washed, you said, before you noticed the crack. If there was poison, it's likely gone." He sighed. "Miss Marple, you're sure about that crack? Could it have been there before the tea?" She shook her head, her voice firm. "I'm certain, Inspector. The cup was perfect when I set it out. The crack appeared during the tea, and I believe it was no accident." Her eyes met his, steady and resolute. Someone wanted that cup to break, or to mark it, and I suspect Dr. Haydock knows more than he's saying. Craddock scribbled a note, his scepticism softening. "I'll press him again. But Miss Marple, be careful. If you're right, this killer's watching you." She smiled faintly, her resolve unshaken. "I'm always careful, Inspector." As she left the station, her thoughts churned. Haydock's alibi had a crack, but so did the poisoner's plan. The teacup, with its deliberate flaw, was the key, and Miss Marple would follow its trail, step by quiet step, until the truth lay bare. Chapter 10. The Teacup's Tale. Thursday afternoon cast a soft golden light over St. Mary Mead, the village settling into an uneasy quiet after days of turmoil. Miss Marple sat in her study, the cracked rosebud teacup on the desk before her, its delicate porcelain catching the glow of a single lamp. The break-in, the chemist's ledger, Dr. Haydock's shaky alibi, all pointed to a poisoner weaving a careful web. But the teacup, with its history and its flaw, held the heart of the mystery. Today, Miss Marple would unravel its tale. She had spent the morning examining the entire rosebud set, each cup and saucer scrutinized under her magnifying glass. The cracked cup, used by Mrs. Dane, was unique, not just for its fracture, but for a faint irregularity she'd missed before. Near the base, hidden by the curve of the handle, was a tiny ridge, almost imperceptible, as if the porcelain had been hollowed and resealed. Her breath caught as she probed it with a hairpin, feeling a slight give. With careful pressure, the ridge parted, revealing a hidden compartment no larger than a thimble. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, yellowed with age, its ink faded but legible. Miss Marple unfolded it with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. To whom it may concern, the deed of 1907 is void. Edward Hartnell's claim is forfeit. A.H. The note was initialed by Amelia Hartnell, the Teacup's original owner, and dated the year of her death. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind racing. A deed, a disgraced brother, a hidden message. This was no ordinary teacup. It was a vault, guarding a secret worth killing for. She closed the compartment, restoring the cup's innocent appearance, and let her thoughts drift to Amelia's life. In 1907, Amelia Hartnell had been at the height of her influence, her manor a hub of village life, but her brother Edward had been a shadow, his gambling debts and forged signatures a constant scandal. The deed in the note likely referred to a property or inheritance, one Edward had tried to claim. Amelia, ever resolute, had nullified it, hiding her proof in the teacup, a place no one would think to look. But someone had known, or suspected, and now 2 women were dead. Miss Marple rose, pacing the study, her shawl slipping as she pieced together the past. She recalled a memory from 1907, a tense tea at Amelia's manor. The guests had included a solicitor, a cousin, and a man introduced as a family friend. His name lost to time, but his face sharp in her mind, with a guarded smile not unlike Mr. Giles's. There had been talk of a will, a heated exchange about Edward's rights, and Amelia's icy dismissal. Had the teacup been on the table that day, its secret already sealed within? Her thoughts turned to the tea-party guests. Mrs. Dane, with her nervous manner and vanished brother, might have known of the Hartnell scandal, perhaps through family ties. Miss Price, with her gossip and prying eyes, could have stumbled on the teacup's significance, perhaps through old letters at the post office. Dr. Haydock, with his cyanide purchase, had the means to kill, but his motive was unclear. Mrs. Bantry, protective of her family's status, might fear a scandal resurfacing, and Mr. Giles, the newcomer with a hidden past, had argued with Miss Price. Had he sought the teacup or its secret? A knock at the door broke her reverie. It was Inspector Craddock, his face etched with fatigue. Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding. We've got nothing new on Haydock. His story holds barely. But I wanted to check on you after that break-in. Any more trouble? She ushered him in, offering tea but keeping the teacup hidden. No trouble, Inspector, but I've been thinking about my teacups. The cracked one, in particular. It's older than I realized, tied to Miss Hartnell's family. There may be history there, worth exploring. Craddock's eyes narrowed. History? You think this is about some old village feud? Miss Marple, we're dealing with a modern killer, not a ghost story. She smiled faintly. The past has a way of lingering, Inspector. Miss Hartnell's brother, Edward, caused quite a stir in his day. Debts, forgery, a disputed will. It's possible someone today has a stake in that old trouble. Craddock scribbled a note, his scepticism clear. I'll look into it, but I'm more concerned with cyanide than old wills. We're checking Giles's background now. Turns out he's not quite the solicitor he claims, and Mrs. Bantry's been cagey about her husband's finances. He stood adjusting his hat. Stay safe, Miss Marple. This killer's desperate. As he left, Miss Marple returned to the teacup, the note now tucked in her notebook. The deed of 1907, Edward's forfeit claim. It was a motive, but for whom? She needed to trace the Hartnell family, to see if their shadows reached the present. The teacup's tale was unfolding, its secret a beacon in the dark. Miss Marple's resolve hardened. She would follow its trail, through the village's whispers and the poisoner's lies, until the truth was hers. Chapter 11. The final guest Friday morning in St. Mary Mead was cloaked in a heavy mist, the village lanes shrouded as if guarding their secrets. Miss Marple stood at her parlour window, her hands clasped, her mind sharp with purpose. The discovery of the note in the rosebud teacup had illuminated a motive tied to Amelia Hartnell's past. But the poisoner remained elusive, their trail marked by 2 deaths and a daring break-in. Now, a new development had raised the stakes. Mrs. Bantry, one of the surviving tea party guests, had narrowly escaped harm the previous evening. Mrs. Bantry had burst into Miss Marple's cottage at dusk, her face pale, her voice trembling. "Jane, it was dreadful. I drank some tea at home, my own blend, mind you, and within minutes I was dizzy, sick. If Colonel Bantry hadn't called Dr. Haydock, I might be dead." The doctor had confirmed a mild poisoning, not cyanide, but a sedative, likely slipped into her tea caddy. Mrs. Bantry was shaken but alive, and Miss Marple saw the pattern clearly. The poisoner was targeting the tea party guests, and only she, Dr. Haydock, and Mr. Giles remained. The near miss galvanized Miss Marple. The killer was growing reckless, their plan unraveling, and she knew the time had come to act. She would stage a gathering, a small, carefully orchestrated tea, to draw the poisoner out. The cracked teacup, with its hidden note, would be her bait, and the guests her suspects. She sent notes to Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and Mr. Giles, inviting them to her cottage that afternoon to discuss recent events. Inspector Craddock was informed, though she asked him to stay outside, watching from a distance. The trap was set. By 3 o'clock, the parlour was ready, the rosebud teacup set prominently on the tea tray, its crack gleaming in the lamplight. The other cups, free of secrets, flanked it, and a fresh pot of Darjeeling steamed gently. Miss Marple, in her best black dress, greeted her guests with a serene smile, her eyes sharp as they took their seats. Mrs. Bantry, still pale but defiant, clutched her handbag tightly. "Jane, I hope you know what you're doing. After last night, I'm half afraid to drink anything." Her voice was loud, but her eyes darted to the teacup, as if sensing its weight. Dr. Haydock, his medical bag at his feet, adjusted his glasses nervously. "A grim occasion, Miss Marple. I trust you've checked the tea." His attempt at humour fell flat, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hand as he reached for a scone. Mr. Giles, impeccably dressed, offered a smooth smile. "Your hospitality remains unmatched, Miss Marple, despite the circumstances. But I confess, I'm curious. Why this gathering, and why now?" His eyes lingered on the cracked teacup, a flicker of something, interest or unease, crossing his face. Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate, ensuring each guest received a cup from the untainted set. "I thought it time we spoke openly," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "2 of our friends are dead, and Clara—" narrowly escaped harm. "This teacup," she gestured to the cracked one, untouched on the tray, "was used by Mrs. Dane. It has a crack, which I believe was no accident, and it holds a secret, one I've only recently uncovered." The room stilled, the air thick with tension. Mrs. Bantry's teaspoon clattered against her saucer. Haydock's fingers tightened on his cup. Giles leaned forward, his smile fading. Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational, but her words precise. "The teacup belonged to Miss Amelia Hartnell, who left a note inside it. A note about a deed, a family scandal, and a brother's forfeited claim. I wonder if any of you know of it," Mrs. Bantry gasped. "A note? Jane, you mean someone killed for that? But I've no connection to the Hartnells, none at all." Her voice was fervent, but Miss Marple caught the quick glance she shot at Haydock. Haydock cleared his throat, his face flushed. "This is fanciful, Miss Marple. I knew Amelia Hartnell, yes, but only as a patient. Her brother was long gone before my time. And cyanide? I've explained that to the police." His words were steady, but his eyes flicked to the teacup, betraying his calm. Giles's voice was smooth, cutting through the tension. "A fascinating tale, Miss Marple, but surely you don't think one of us is a poisoner? I'm a newcomer, barely acquainted with village history. If this note exists, perhaps it's a relic, nothing more." His tone was dismissive, but his fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, a tell Miss Marple noted. She sipped her tea, her gaze moving from one guest to another. "Relics can be dangerous, Mr. Giles, when they threaten secrets. Mrs. Dane's brother, like Amelia's, was a troubled man. Miss Price knew everyone's business, and Clara's family has ties to old village matters. Someone at this table, I believe, knows why the teacup matters, and why it was marked." The silence was electric, each guest frozen, their faces a mask of nerves or defiance. Miss Marple set her cup down, her voice soft but piercing. "The poisoner is here among us, and they will act again unless we uncover the truth. Shall we start with the teacup, or with your secrets?" Mrs. Bantry's hand flew to her mouth. Haydock's jaw clenched, and Giles's eyes narrowed, but no one spoke. The cracked teacup sat on the tray, a silent challenge, and Miss Marple waited, her trap sprung, her heart steady. The final guest, she knew, would reveal themselves, not in words, but in the flicker of a glance, the tremor of a hand, the crack in their carefully crafted lies. Chapter 12. The Crack Widens. The air in Miss Marple's parlour was taut as a bowstring, the lamplight casting long shadows across the faces of her guests. The rosebud teacup, with its hidden note and deliberate crack, sat on the tea-tray, a silent accusation. Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and Mr. Giles sat rigid, their eyes flickering between the teacup and Miss Marple, whose serene demeanour belied the steel in her gaze. She had laid her trap, baited with the teacup's secret, and now she watched, waiting for the poisoner to betray themselves. Mrs. Bantry broke the silence, her voice shrill. "Jane, this is absurd. You can't think I'd poison anyone. Eschew. Bantrys have lived in St. Mary Mead for generations. Our name means something." Her hands twisted her handkerchief, but her eyes darted to Mr. Giles, a flash of suspicion in them. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his glasses glinting as he leaned forward. "Miss Marple, I respect your insight, but you're reaching. That teacup note some old family spat, has nothing to do with me. I bought cyanide for a test, yes, but the police found none in my possession. And Clara's poisoning. I saved her, didn't I?" His tone was defensive, but his fingers gripped his medical bag. "A tick," Miss Marple noted. "Mr. Giles," his smile thin, spread his hands. "I'm flattered to be included in your drama, Miss Marple, but I'm a stranger here. Amelia Hartnell? Her brother? I know nothing of them. If this note is real, perhaps it's a distraction, a clever one, but irrelevant." His voice was smooth, but his eyes lingered on the teacup, and Miss Marple caught the faintest tightening of his jaw. She sipped her tea, her movements deliberate, her voice gentle but unyielding. "The note is real, Mr. Giles, and it points to a motive. Amelia Hartnell's brother, Edward, lost his claim to a valuable deed in 1907. That deed, I suspect, is still worth something. Land, perhaps, or shares. Someone at my tea party knew of it, and they've killed to keep it hidden." She paused, her eyes moving from one guest to another. The cracked teacup was their mistake. It was meant to break, to destroy the note, but it didn't, and now it's here watching us. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Jane, you're saying someone tampered with your teacup? At your tea? But we were all there, eating scones, chatting." Her voice faltered, and she looked at Haydock, then Giles, her fear palpable. Miss Marple nodded, setting her cup down. "Exactly, Clara. Someone at that table handled the teacup carefully, ensured it went to Mrs. Dane. She was nervous, perhaps because she knew too much, about Edward Hartnell, or someone connected to him. Miss Price, with her gossip, was a threat, and you, Clara, were targeted when you started asking questions." She turned to Haydock. "Doctor, you passed Mrs. Dane her cup. Did you choose it deliberately?" Haydock's face reddened. "That's preposterous. I was being courteous, nothing more. I had no reason to harm anyone." His voice rose, but his eyes flicked to the teacup, and Miss Marple saw a shadow of doubt in them. Giles leaned back, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Marple, you weave a compelling story, but you've no proof. A cracked teacup, a vague note, hardly evidence of murder. If I were you, I'd leave this to the police. Stirring up accusations could be dangerous." His tone was light, but the warning was clear, and Miss Marple felt the weight of his gaze. She met it calmly, her voice soft but piercing. "Dangerous, Mr. Giles? Perhaps, but the poisoner is the one in danger now. They've left too many clues. The crack, the cyanide, the break-in at my cottage. They wanted the teacup, didn't they, to ensure the note stayed hidden?" She reached for the cracked teacup, holding it up, the lamplight catching its fracture. "But it's here and it's speaking. Who among you is afraid of what it says?" The room froze, the silence heavy with unspoken truths. Mrs. Bantry's breathing was shallow, her eyes wide. Haydock's hand twitched as if reaching for his bag, then stilled. Giles's smile vanished, his fingers curling into fists. Miss Marple watched them all, her heart steady, her mind sharp. She had no confession yet, no concrete proof. But she saw the crack widening, not in the teacup, but in the poisoner's facade. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry whispered, "what if they try again? Right now?" Her voice trembled, and she pushed her teacup away, as if it might bite. Miss Marple set the cracked teacup down, her smile reassuring, but her eyes cold. They won't, Clara. Not today. The police are outside, and the teacup is safe. But I invite you all to think about secrets, about motives, about what you might lose if the truth comes out. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly. More tea, anyone? No one moved, their faces a gallery of fear, guilt, and defiance. Miss Marple's trap had not yet sprung, but the crack had widened, and she knew the poisoner was teetering. Push, then push one more truth, and they would fall. The teacup, with its rosebud pattern and hidden note, sat quietly on the tray, its tale almost told. Chapter 13. A Sip of Truth. The parlour of Miss Marple's cottage glowed with the soft warmth of lamplight, but the air was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The cracked rosebud teacup sat on the tea-tray, its hidden note now a silent witness. To the gathering, Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and Mr. Giles remained, their faces taut, while Inspector Craddock and a constable stood just outside, summoned by Miss Marple's discreet signal. The surviving guests of her fateful tea party, along with the police, were here for the final reckoning. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp and her voice steady, was ready to reveal the poisoner. She stood, her black dress rustling softly, and lifted the cracked teacup, its rosebud pattern catching the light. "This teacup," she began, her tone gentle but commanding, "has told us a story. It began with a crack, a deliberate flaw, and led to a note hidden within. A note about a deed, a scandal, and a motive for murder. 2 women, Mrs. Dane and Miss Price, died because of it, and Clara narrowly escaped. Tonight we will end this tale." Mrs. Bantry clutched her handkerchief, her voice trembling. "Jane, please, just tell us. Who did it? I can't bear this suspense." Her eyes darted to Haydock and Giles, fear mingling with accusation. Dr. Haydock adjusted his glasses, his face pale. "Miss Marple, I've cooperated fully. The cyanide in my ledger was accounted for. I'm no killer." His words were firm, but his hands betrayed him, twisting the handle of his medical bag. Mr. Giles, his smile long gone, leaned forward, his voice low. "This is a dangerous game, Miss Marple. Accuse the wrong person, and you'll regret it. You've no proof, only theories." His eyes, cold and calculating, met hers, but she held his gaze without flinching. Miss Marple set the teacup down and folded her hands. "Proof, Mr. Giles, is in the details. Let me explain." She turned to the group, her voice clear. The note in the teacup, written by Amelia Hartnell, declared her brother Edward's claim to a 1907 deed void. That deed, I've learned, was for a parcel of land, now valuable with plans for development. Someone among us had a stake in that land, a secret worth killing for. She paused, her eyes on Mrs. Bantry. "Clara, your family has deep roots in St. Mary Mead. The Bantry estate borders the Hartnell land. If Edward's claim resurfaced, it could complicate your husband's finances, already strained. You were at the tea, and you knew Miss Price's gossip could stir old scandals. But your attempt to protect your family was clumsy. Your poisoning was a warning, not a death." Mrs. Bantry gasped, her face crumpling. "Jane, no! I'd never! My tea was tampered with! I'm a victim!" Her distress was genuine, and Miss Marple nodded, her gaze softening. "Indeed, Clara, you are. Which leaves 2. She turned to Haydock. "Doctor, Your cyanide purchase raised suspicions, and your alibi for Mrs. Dane's death was weak. You handled her teacup at the tea, and your medical knowledge would make poisoning easy. But your motive was unclear. Until I considered your father, a solicitor who worked for Amelia Hartnell. He was at her 1907 tea, wasn't he? He knew of the deed, and you, his heir, might have inherited that knowledge. Haydock's jaw tightened, his voice rising. My father! He's been dead for years. I know nothing of any deed. This is absurd. But his hands shook, and Miss Marple saw the fear in his eyes. She turned to Giles, her voice calm but piercing. And you, Mr. Giles, or should I say Edward Hartnell's son? You arrived in St. Mary Mead under a false name, claiming to be a solicitor, but Miss Price recognized you. She argued with you, hinted at your past. You knew the teacup held the note that could ruin your claim to the Hartnell land, a claim your father believed was his. You cracked the teacup to destroy it, but when it didn't break fully, you poisoned Mrs. Dane, who suspected your identity through her own brother's ties to Edward. Miss Price was next, for her gossip, and Clara for asking too many questions. Giles's face was a mask, but his fingers curled into fists. A pretty story, Miss Marple, but pure fiction. I'm Rupert Giles, not some Hartnell heir. You've no evidence. His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked to the teacup, betraying him. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Evidence, Mr. Giles, is in the teacup itself. The crack was deliberate, scored with a tool. Your tool, left behind during the break-in at my cottage. The police found it in your rented rooms, along with traces of cyanide, hidden in a false bottom of your suitcase. And Miss Price's assistant overheard you threatening her, mentioning the Hartnell matter. You underestimated St. Mary Mead's memory. Craddock stepped forward, his face grim. She's right, Giles. We searched your rooms this afternoon. The tool, the cyanide, it's enough to charge you. You're under arrest. The constable moved to Giles's side, handcuffs ready. Giles's composure shattered, his voice a snarl. You meddling old woman! That land was mine, my father's birthright. They cheated him, and I'd have taken it back. He lunged for the teacup, but Craddock restrained him, the constable securing his wrists. Mrs. Bantry sobbed. Haydock exhaled shakily, and Miss Marple remained still, her eyes on the teacup. As Giles was led away, the parlour fell silent, the tension draining like water from a cracked cup. Craddock turned to her, his voice low. Miss Marple, you're a marvel. But how did you know? She picked up the teacup, its rosebud pattern gleaming. People are like porcelain, Inspector. They crack under pressure, and the truth spills out. I only listened. She set it down, her smile serene. Now, shall we have another pot of tea? The room softened, the cottage's warmth returning. Outside St. Mary Mead lay quiet, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple glanced at the teacup, its tale complete and reflected on the fragility of greed, of secrets, of human hearts. The crack had widened, and the truth had been her sip of victory.